They came dressed like cops, flashing fake badges, demanding money for so-called HOA fees. But what they didn't know was that the man they tried to arrest wasn't just a homeowner. He was a Special Forces veteran, and what happened next left the entire neighborhood in shock and exposed one of the biggest HOA scams the town had ever seen. It was a quiet evening in Brookside Meadows, the kind of neighborhood where people waved to each other across manicured lawns, where the mailboxes all looked the same, and where the HOA board bragged about how they kept order. But behind the perfect lawns and polite smiles lurked something darker, an HOA that had become more like a gang than a neighborhood association. And they had a new target, Marcus Bryant. Marcus had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier. A tall, quiet man in his late 30s, Marcus lived alone in a modest home. He wasn't flashy, didn't throw parties, and always paid his bills on time. What most neighbors didn't know was that Marcus was a former Special Forces operator, a man who had seen combat, endured unimaginable hardships, and survived. To him, Brookside Meadows was supposed to be a place of peace, a new chapter. But peace was the last thing the HOA was willing to give him. The HOA in Brookside was run by a small group led by a man named Gerald Whitman. Gerald loved power. To him, the HOA wasn't about maintaining lawns or collecting small dues. It was about control. Gerald began sending Marcus fines. First, it was $50 for parking too close to the curb, then $100 for grass height violations. Marcus mowed every week. His yard was perfect. He knew the fines were bogus. When Marcus refused to pay, the letters escalated: $500 late fees, threats of foreclosure, demands that he attend HOA meetings. Marcus ignored them, knowing they had no legal standing. But Gerald wasn't finished. One night, just after sunset, Marcus heard loud banging on his front door. "Open up! HOA Enforcement Police!" Marcus froze. HOA Police? He'd never heard of such a thing. Through the peephole, he saw 2 men wearing cheap uniforms, dark blue with patches that looked suspiciously homemade. They wore utility belts with handcuffs and carried what looked like batons. One flashed a shiny badge that could have been bought at a dollar store. "Mr. Bryant," one shouted, "you're under arrest for failure to pay HOA dues." "Step outside now!" Marcus narrowed his eyes. He knew real police procedure. He knew how arrests were supposed to work. These men weren't cops. They weren't even security. They were imposters, thugs hired by Gerald. Marcus opened the door slowly, his face calm. "Arrest?" he asked. "On what authority?" The taller man sneered. "On the authority of the Brookside Meadows HOA." Marcus almost laughed. "That's not how the law works." The man stepped forward. "If you don't come quietly, we'll drag you out." But Marcus's years of Special Forces training kicked in. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. Instead, he scanned their posture, their grip on their weapons, their lack of professional discipline. Amateurs. Within seconds, Marcus moved. He twisted the baton from the first man's hand, sent him sprawling to the ground with a simple joint lock, then turned to the second before he could react. In less than 10 seconds, both men were disarmed, groaning on the porch. Begging him to stop, Marcus stood over them, his voice ice-cold. "You picked the wrong house." Marcus dragged both men inside and sat them on his living room floor, zip-tying their wrists with gear he still kept from his military days. Then he called the real police. "This is Marcus Bryant," he said calmly. "I have 2 suspects impersonating police officers and attempting unlawful arrest at my home. You'd better send units now." When officers arrived minutes later, the scene left them stunned. 2 fake HOA cops sitting restrained in Marcus's living room, their phony badges on the coffee table. The truth came out quickly. Gerald had created his own so-called HOA enforcement unit, complete with fake uniforms, to intimidate homeowners into paying bogus fines. News spread like wildfire. Neighbors watched from their lawns as the imposters were marched into real squad cars, faces pale with shame. At the HOA board meeting that week, the entire neighborhood erupted. People demanded answers. They demanded Gerald's resignation. Some shouted that they feared for their safety. If Gerald could create a fake police force, what else was he capable of? For years, Gerald had bullied homeowners, fined them unfairly, and abused his power. But now his scheme was exposed for all to see. Scene 7. The fallout Gerald was arrested and charged with conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, and attempted extortion. The HOA board dissolved under pressure, and a city investigation uncovered years of fraud and theft. Marcus, however, stayed quiet through it all. He wasn't looking for revenge. He only wanted peace. Neighbors who once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a hero. Parents shook his hand. Kids waved at him when he walked by. People whispered, "That's the guy who took down Gerald's fake cops." One evening, a neighbor asked Marcus why he didn't move away after all that chaos. Marcus smiled faintly and said, "I've been through worse. This neighborhood isn't perfect, but bullies only win if good people stay silent. And I won't stay silent." It was the kind of quiet strength that defined him, a man who had fought battles overseas and at home, and who refused to be intimidated, no matter what disguise corruption wore. In the end, the HOA's abuse of power was no match for one man's courage. Gerald thought he could scare Marcus into submission with fake uniforms and phony authority. But Marcus knew the truth, and he knew the law. And when push came to shove, it was the HOA that fell apart, not him. Because sometimes the strongest weapon isn't force. It's standing your ground.